Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to AGG and Taylor Wessing's webinar, The Long and Winding Road, Some EU and FDA Issues to Consider with Clinical Trials and Clinical Agreements. It's a nod to the Beatles. If you don't know who the Beatles are, you can Google it later. I'm Alan Minsk, and I'm a partner with Arnold, Glenn, and Gregory, and I co-chair AGG's Food and Drug Practice Group. I am pleased to co-host this webinar with Dr. Manja, Epping, and Irina, Rebin, who are attorneys in Taylor Wessing's Healthcare and Life Sciences practice. Before we start, for those who need continuing legal education credits, particularly in the United States, this webinar is approved for 1 hour of CLE credit by the State Bar of Georgia. We can't guarantee that other states will accept it, but we have found that they typically do. If you require CLE credit and would like to receive a general certificate of attendance, please complete our survey, which is at the end, and it'll be emailed to you following the webinar. We'll also be sending a PDF of the slides and a link to the recording. We also hope to allow a few minutes at the end for questions and answers, and I believe that there's a box where you can ask your questions. I am not the IT guy here, and you may submit them by typing in the question tab on your control panel. If you have any IT questions, the folks at Taylor Wessing or at AGG will help you, not us, the lawyers. Okay, so now let's get started. Oh boy, I may need some help. Let's see. There we go. So one of the things to keep in mind is that you don't want to have what I find often, and again, I'm on the FDA side, is that often in clinical trial agreements, or like any agreement, whether it's a quality agreement, pharmacovigilance, often people decide that they don't want to get too legalistic. And I get that. They want to try to keep it as simple as possible. Except this is a contract involving an FDA-regulated activity. And while FDA's terms are not divinely inspired, FDA has 3 letters, God has 3 letters, forgive me if I've offended anybody in the Jewish faith. I'm in the 10 days of repentance, so forgive me. It should be considered sacred. That is, it's not a time to become, Richards and Jagger or Lennon and McCartney. If you don't know who I'm talking about, again, I'm dating myself. It's advised to use the defined terms. So, for example, adverse event experiences, complaints, timelines, all of these various things are defined by FDA. So if Manja and I are doing an agreement and Manja and I are not using the same language, or she has an understanding and I have an understanding, this is not going to be a good idea. But if we have the same understanding because we're using the same language in FDA's either regulations or in guidance, then we're going to minimize confusion, minimize consternation, and minimize potential issues, sort of, if a problem arises. Everyone's happy when they're dating, and hopefully in their early years of marriage. And I've been married 22 years, I'm happily married. But once you're married, and you've got, it's only when something goes wrong that everyone gets ticked off. So we want to try to minimize that to begin with. So companies make mistakes when they try to get too creative or they summarize certain terms rather than using them verbatim. Another example would be when people say, as soon as possible, notifying somebody as soon as possible. What does that mean? Is this biblical as soon as possible? Is this lawyer time as soon as possible? Is this FDA as soon as possible? Well, it is going to be FDA as soon as possible, and that may be 24 hours. That may be 48 hours. That may be 72 hours. As soon as you become aware. Those are terms or timelines that are defined in regulation or in guidance. So that should be used in an agreement. So again, not only do these terms be included in the contract because if FDA asks, but you're minimizing problems by having a common vocabulary. Then you get into the issue of signature authority. Sometimes it will come up as who is signing the agreement. Is it the investigator? Is the investigator a doctor at a medical practice, at a clinic? Are they a university professor who's serving as a clinical investigator, and this is being done at the university. So who's signing? Who should be signing? And what are the consequences of that? So it may be, for example, that a university says only they can sign if there is a study being done at their university and the clinical investigator is an employee. Maybe the medical practice has a similar provision. Maybe they don't. So I think you have to ask yourself who's signing, who has the authority to sign, because what you don't want is that Dr. Minsk says, yeah, I'm good with this, but my law firm says you didn't have the authority to sign that. And by the way, what if the investigator leaves the institution? Did you sign up with the investigator or did you sign up with the university? Are you following the investigator, which means you have to close the agreement with the institution if they were the signatory? So or are you going to get a new investigator at the university? Again, I don't have the answer in your particular fact pattern, but those are the questions to ask. Are you staying with the investigator? Are you staying with the institution? And by the way, the clinical investigator, if they've signed what we call sort of the 1571, 1572 forms that they're the clinical investigator, they've got the regulatory obligations. But the university might have obligations as well. So again, it's a long way of saying who's signing what and do they have the authority. It's important to define the roles and responsibilities. And whether this is a clinical trial agreement or, again, any kind of agreement, we happen to advise in quality agreements and pharmacovigilance agreements, in any type of agreement, you need to know who's doing what. Taylor Wessing at AGG defined over a couple of calls who was handling what, who was handling the marketing, who was going to speak first, what we were going to speak about. I'm doing FDA, Taylor Wessing's doing the EU part. Similarly with the clinical trial agreement, who is doing what? The sponsor, whether or not it's for a drug, device, biologic, they've got the regulatory obligations because they're the sponsor. Of course, the investigator / institution may have obligations as well. So you need to define that early. And when I say early, I don't mean, the 11th hour where you're sending it to either Manja or Irina or me and saying, we've got this question. You want to make sure that your clinical investigative team or your regulatory advice team have been involved early. So you might think about, I don't want to make this complicated, but for example, in a quality agreement, you might have a chart or a matrix. You may think about that in a clinical trial agreement if it's not clear in the agreement itself. That is, who is doing what, who will review what, who has the obligation to do what. More often than not, that's actually in the agreement itself, and you may not need a chart or a matrix. But if there's going to be several people involved or several groups involved, that may be a way to do it. And the last point there is that you want to have a complete contact information for expedited notices and responses. And it's not just necessarily a proper, a specific person, but it may be, regulatory affairs at agg.com or clinical affairs, because if I leave the firm, who's going to handle it? Well, it might be Bob Durkin, it might be Laura Dona, whoever. And same thing at Taylor Wessing. The person may have left, and so it's going to be either undeliverable or it's going to go in a junk email or whatever. So you want to make sure that you've got a person you can talk to. We will take questions at the end. What I will say is if there are particular questions where we use a defined term, or that kind of thing, I'm happy to answer it. But I think, what I would say that in general, you would address in a CTA or clinical trial agreement, you want to try to address what will happen if the PI, the principal investigator, the clinical investigator leaves. Are you going with them or I'm not going with them? I'm happy to take the institution's suggestion or what have you. Those are all things you might consider putting in the agreement itself. Okay, so when you enter into the agreement, shall we dance? Okay, like any agreement, you would do some due diligence. And we think of due diligence as typically, well, am I going to buy a product? Am I going to buy a company? Am I going to do a contract for contract manufacturing? Whatever. But there's no reason why you wouldn't do due diligence with the clinical trial partner. Now, we typically think of that as being, well, Dr. Jones has been a clinical investigator. He or she's well known. And so the clinical folks are involved. Yeah, they can handle it. But what about the regulatory folks? They have to make sure it's not just that Dr. Jones is a smart person and knows how to run a study, but you want regulatory to feel comfortable. Well, have they done clinical trials before? Do they know how to spell FDA? Do they know what a PI means? Just basic things. So you want to make sure that your site can is in compliance with FDA. How have they done with past inspections? What are the teams? Who are the sub-investigators? Do they have the financial stability to handle this? By the way, are they in a country that maybe has got political turmoil going on? Are they a place that FDA can't inspect, but that's going to be irrelevant when there's a pre-approval inspection on the drug? So if you're doing the study, for example, in some country where it's war-torn or they've got a lot of weather issues, but yet FDA would want to look at them when they're now looking at the final drug product application, drug, device, biologic, you name it. But he says, I can't go to that site because there's civil war or there's horrible weather. Well, that may delay the application. So while much of the compliance information is publicly available, such as looking under the Freedom of Information Act or establishment inspection reports or 483s, which is notice of observations or warning letters, it can take months, if not years, to get this information from FDA. So you might as well ask for it from the partner ahead of time. And if they don't want to share it, that may be a red flag, or they may be concerned about confidential information, so they can redact it. Again, presumably the site will want to comply with the request to expedite the transaction. It's also part, again, as I said, it may be that the party's hesitant to show certain things that they consider, proprietary, confidential, what have you. But they won't, but again, you have a right to kick the tires and to know what's going on. Again, it may be that you can redact certain information. Maybe you have a separate confidentiality agreement with that party. There's ways to deal with this. Moving on. Continuing on with the shall we dance theme, you want verifiable trust, okay? At the end of the day, you want this to work out, but as I said before, everyone's happy in the beginning. But then the question is, after the honeymoon, or are we prepared after the honeymoon that there may be some wrinkles? So we have to consider that sooner rather than later. So again, it's not a deal breaker if they won't share it. But what I will tell you is that when we're involved in due diligence, and the other side, whether it's a clinical site, a clinical investigator, whatever, an institution, if they're being very difficult about doing this, it's a red flag. One, because I wonder what they're hiding, or two, my God, if we're trying to court one another now, we can't get the information now, how's it going to be once we actually have performance of the agreement? So it just may be a sign that they're not well organized. Okay, just things to think about. So show me yours and I'll show you mine. You want to include a provision in the agreement that if the application holder, that if you are the application holder, again, for a new drug application, for a 510K or a PMA for a device, or a BLA, biologic license application for a biologic, or any type of clinical trial application, that you would be notified as soon as possible, but again, with a specific time, if the site's being inspected and under investigation by FDA. Now, let's say that Manja and I are the ones doing a deal, and Manja says, and Manja's the clinical trial site where she's the investigator and she's being inspected. She may say, Alan, this has nothing to do with your drug or your device that I'm doing the study. And I says, that may be, but I can tell you from experience, Manja, if FDA is there, you're preoccupied and you're probably not focusing as much on me and other people because you're trying to deal with the FDA. So at a minimum, you're going to be delayed on my project. And if it is my product, well, then even more so, I need to be involved. And if it's my product, I probably want to be involved in the resolution. That is, I probably want to see your response to FDA. I want to see the FDA request for documents. I may even want to be able to provide comments to your response if you get some sort of deficiency letter, typically 483. You also want to include a provision that you can audit the site for compliance. Again, It's verifiable trust. And at the end of the day, as the sponsor, you have certain regulatory obligations, and you're looking to the site to provide certain data that you're going to use for the application. And if the data is going to be problematic, or if the site is problematic from compliance, that may call into question all the data that I want to use to support my marketing application with FDA. That's why all of this is so important. So FDA considerations in an agreement. Clearly define who's responsible for what, such as, I say here GMP, I might just say GXP, good clinical practices, good laboratory practices, good manufacturing practice. So sometimes it's referred to as GXP. Informed consent, institutional review board, complaint handling, disposition of drug, if I have to do some sort of corrective action. Again, that would presumably be in the contract itself. If it's going to be overly complicated, perhaps you have a matrix or a chart. And again, it gets back to who is going to be doing what and what's expected. You want to get this out up front. Where I get nervous is when I see, well, both parties will be involved. I have no problem with both parties being involved because, of course, they got to be involved. But who's got the primary responsibility? And by the way, the sponsor can try to delegate certain responsibilities away. But at the end of the day, I'm just going to tell you, because I represent typically more of the drug device biologic companies, although we do represent some CROs, but primarily we're representing the manufacturers. FDA is going to look to the manufacturer at the end of the day, and the manufacturer is the one who's got the application going to FDA. The application holder should not allow the site to subcontract out responsibilities without giving and obtaining written consent. That is, it may be that Manja says, you know what, I'm not going to be able to do this, or I've got a lot of projects, so I'm delegating to Irina. I may have no problem with that as long as I'm able to look at, Irina's CV. I'm comfortable that she can do the job, and I provide that in written, whatever. But it can't be that Manja says to me, oh, by the way, after the fact, I delegated this to Irina, and Irina wasn't qualified, for example. She's very qualified. As a lawyer, I'm just simply saying, let's say in a clinical trial example, participating as a PI or a sub-PI. Moving on. Don't be shy, get involved. It's important that the right people get involved. And when I say the right people, it's not just the clinical affairs people, but I would also say the regulatory people and maybe the QA people. Sometimes if you're sort of a virtual, and maybe that you're doing all these various things. If you're a larger company, you may have different people involved. Because everyone's going to have a piece of this agreement or of this project. You've got the clinical trial folks, you've got the regulatory folks who are dealing with FDA. Of course, you got the lawyers, maybe QA or pharmacovigilance people, depending again how big your company is. So it's important that you have the right people in earlier rather than later. Even if it's a concept or a project, I would at least copy people on an email to say, hey, we're thinking about working with X university, X doctor. Okay, this is the plan. We may need to get you involved here and there. That way, at least regulatory and legal and whoever else may be appropriate is involved sooner rather than later, and it will minimize delays. It will minimize confusion at the outset, and hopefully minimize, if not eliminate, litigation if there's a problem that goes away. Now, the other point there is if a party says, well, this is how we've always done it, or we spoke to FDA, or whatever, this is just the way it's done. Verifiable trust, okay? It may be that a university or a principal investigator has done something a certain way. And I'm not even saying it's wrong, but at the end of the day, it has to comply with the law. And at the end of the day, if they don't comply, and I'm the sponsor, this is going to come back to bite me. So it's just so. We spoke to FDA. This was our interpretation. Show me with whom you spoke. Show me in the law what you're relying on. Show me in the guidance document, which is not legally binding, but it's FDA's current thinking. If they can't provide that support, you need to be cautious. Moving on. Did Simon say? Again, define what changes, if any, the site can make and where the sponsor must provide prior written approval before the change is made. Again, what is a minor change? What is a major change? I see this often in contracts. It drives me crazy. What is a minor change? I don't know what that means. We don't think the patient's going to die. Okay, well, or a major change is, well, this could affect the patient could die. I don't know what that means. Okay, just like promptly or as soon as possible. So you may need to define that. Maybe that's a defined term in a regulation. Maybe that's a guidance document. Maybe that's something in the protocol. But again, the change may actually trigger regulatory obligations. I may have to affirmatively change the protocol. I may affirmatively have to change the IND. I may affirmatively have to talk to FDA, or maybe I won't. But that gets back to where the sponsor needs to think about these things. I can't have a clinical site investigator just make a unilateral change without me knowing about it. On the other hand, I also understand that it can't just simply be, hey, can I go to the bathroom? I got to get the regulatory affairs, permission. So you're going to have to find that balance. And again, that gets back to the deliberations and discussions at the outset. So it's not just regulatory risks, but also potential liability risks. FDA inspections, and then I'm going to try to finish up. FDA can conduct bioresearch inspections. It's very clear in the law. This would cover clinical trials, preclinical trials, and other activities that are used to support a marketing application. So you need to be aware of FDA's guidances. There was a recent guidance that was issued, and I've given you, I think it's a hyperlink, but if not, at least you can look it up. Informed consent, guidance to IRBs, institutional review boards, clinical investigators, and sponsors. By the way, refusal to permit an inspection is a violation of law. You would think, who would be that stupid? Literally last week, FDA sent a warning letter to a company that didn't respond. Most companies are not going to have the shotgun that says you can't come into my facility. That's happened. That's not typical. Most people are not, militia type people or crazy. It often can be, well, I want to see a certain document, and the company just doesn't provide it. Or FDA, either by phone or by email or in person, and the company says, well, I'm not going to provide it, or the site doesn't provide it. FDA can say, you've now denied me inspection. So it's important for you to know what FDA is allowed to look at, what they're not allowed to look at. That's a separate talk. But if you don't allow FDA something to review that they're legally allowed to, FDA can throw out that that's a denial or it's a refusal to permit an inspection. And for products that are coming, let's say it's a ex-US site, let's say it's ex-US materials coming into the United States. If that ex-US site is perceived to be violative, or unless FDA doesn't know, they could hold up the clinical trial material at the border with customs. It's not really FDA, it's more customs. So let's say that Manja in Germany is not compliant with FDA rules in some form or another, or FDA doesn't know if she's compliant. They're going to say, when in doubt, we're going to hold up the product that's coming in. So the material, the materials that maybe let me say it this way, it wasn't clear. Let's say that Manja is providing the materials ex-US in the United States for clinical trials. If we're not comfortable, if FDA is not comfortable with that site or with that API manufacturer, whoever, they could hold the product up. So there's that. And similarly, if Manja is running a German clinical trial, but for US purposes, FDA may have concerns about the data going into the application itself. So I hope that was clear. Moving on. Not compliance with FDA and non-FDA issues very quickly. Significant numbers of deficiencies include problems with protocol deviations, records, and IRB communications. Agency also typically scrutinizes investigators who are doing a large number of trials, as well as so-called outliers. Those are trials where the data deviates too far from the data from other trial sites. That is, all the other sites are showing X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden this site is showing A, B, and C. Again, it may be that there's an explanation, but that would concern the FDA. Other red flags might be that you enroll more subjects than allowed, or the sites that have received FDA, what these call Form 483, previously the deficiencies of a site. Moving on. Don't forget compliance with non-FDA issues such as HIPAA, which is privacy laws, cybersecurity laws, the anti-kickback statute, which is healthcare compliance, Sunshine Act, and state reporting. If I'm giving a clinical investigator in the United States who happens to also be a healthcare provider, I have to disclose that. It's fine, but I have to disclose that compensation. Key concerns for FDA inspectors include data integrity, subject protection, and the proper conduct of sites. Reviewers do not like trials with study imbalances, lots of dropouts, study changes, protocol deviations, and hidden problems. Changes in the clinical studies should be made through protocol amendments and not without authorization. Moving on beyond HIPAA and Sunshine Act, moving on, we would get into also sort of the IP issues. This is going to be a little bit beyond, this really is beyond the talk here because I'm more of a healthcare FDA guy, but just patent issues. State and public investigators and sites often will not agree to liability caps or indemnification. So let's say you're doing it with a state university or the Red Crosses of the world. They may say, well, it's sweet that you want to cap certain things or that you want to hold us responsible for certain things or you want us to indemnify, but our state law doesn't allow it. Well, we're a federal government agency and we can't allow that. The same thing would also be with publication. Any data that's generated at our state university by the employee, the employee of a state university or a state entity or whatever, that's ours. And you say, wait a second, that's not yours, that's mine. You only got that because of it's my drug. And they say, yeah, but this is only intellectual property because of our genius. Those issues are going to come up and you're going to have to see, is the state right? Is the state wrong? Is the federal agency right? Are they wrong? Those are issues that come up. Who owns what? And that might include samples and biological materials and data. Okay, and then just very quickly, because I want to be mindful of the time for Manja and Irina. Trade secrets, PHI, private health information, confidentiality, informed consent. Very quickly, that's just sort of some of the trade secret materials that you want to consider, what might be trade secret and where there might be trade secret protection. Again, I've just sort of given you bullets. We have partners who deal with those issues here. Manja has people on her end who deal with it in the EU. But I just wanted to make sure you were aware of these types of issues beyond the FDA. These are, again, more in the IP realm. Still use of data from trials, confidentiality, informed consent, and explanation of subjects of uses of data that gets back into informed consent. Some of that will be FDA related, obviously informed consent, but it also may be with privacy issues, HIPAA, cybersecurity, intellectual property, those kinds of things. And it can, again, what can happen? A non-compliance can lead to a clinical hold. That is, you have to stop doing the study, refusal to accept data in the marketing application, loss of credibility with FDA. That's intangible, but that's huge. Enforcement actions, such as a warning letter that would go to the clinical investigator, the clinical site, disqualification of the principal investigator investigations, and other delays in the marketing application review, and more questions. A question begets a question begets a question. Observations. My gosh. Companies should audit and monitor sites for compliance, keep an eye on privacy requirements and obligations. An agreement without follow-up and proper execution is merely a piece of paper. Some of you may remember the Seinfeld episode that when he was trying to, in a rental car, where's my car? Well, we don't have a car for you. I don't understand. I made a reservation. We understand, but we don't have any cars. And he goes, no, I don't think you understand the concept of a reservation, because if you did, well, then I'd have a car. You see, the hold is the most important. Anyone can enter into an agreement. It's really the hold or the execution. Proactive planning is needed, and conduct periodic reviews of the reviews to make sure that they're current and relevant. I think that is is that it? For me, that is it for me. I'm now going to turn over to Manja. I'm going to go off camera. I know we've already got a couple of questions, but we'll do this at the end. Manja, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alan, for this great overview over the FDA issues and the clinical trials under the US law and all the examples you have given involving myself. So also from our side, a very warm welcome to all our participants in this webinar, and we will continue with clinical investigation in the EU, covering medical devices and medicinal products. We try to do that as comprehensively and quickly at the same time as possible. So to those of you who may not be as familiar with the legal background in the EU, just a short summary. The regulatory framework for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, in vitro medical devices, has changed significantly over the past 2 years. So we had 3 directives, 2 on medical devices, 1 on IVDs, which have now been replaced by 2 regulations, the MDR, medical devices regulation, and the IVDR for in vitro diagnostics. The MDR is applicable now since the 26th of May 2021. The IVDR as of May 26, 2022. In both cases, there are still a couple of transitional periods running, so also for devices which are sold under certificates under the old law. Why has this framework been changed? that, unlike regulations, directives are not directly applicable in the market, but must first be implemented into national law. This results sometimes in significant deviations between the laws in the different national legal systems. The European Commission decided to change that and propose then 2 regulations which are directly applicable for all the players and operators in the medical devices business. As you can see in this picture, the number of provisions has significantly increased. So the new legal framework is much more comprehensive than the former one, and this also affects clinical trials. So in the field of clinical trials, we've seen a standardization of clinical investigations in the EU, or we will see that when all the tools will become operational. There's a new approval procedure then that may be followed, and that can lead to a one-stop shop once everything, including the IT system, works. There will be increased transparency of clinical investigations, whether you like it or not. So results of clinical trials need to be published. The clinical study report, when everything works, will be uploaded into the European database, and everybody can see the result of the clinical trial, whether it's positive or negative. And there's also much of a huge catalog of definitions of clinical trials, of serious adverse events. So all this is now unified in the European Union, which maybe make things easier also for manufacturers and other players coming from outside the EU. And there are extensive provisions on the protection of trial subjects, extensive requirements for informed consent, and the protection of special groups like minors or other groups of people that need special protection. I already mentioned it. One of the major novelties is a new IT system, which is called Udemid. Unfortunately, we've had lots of problems with this new IT system and database. So it should have been operational for a long time, but it's only partly operational, and the module number 4, which covers clinical trials, is not yet operational, so that for the time being, applications for clinical trials need to be made via the different national systems, but that will change over time. The Udemid, once it is operational and works, will cover inter alia the overall management of data. So the application will be done, application for changes, submissions of amendments, and notification of serious adverse events. So the vigilance notifications will be made via this system, and as I said, also the uploading of the final study report. So in addition, I would like to say 2 things here. So in addition to the European regulations, you will also have to observe the national laws. So the national laws are not completely obsolete. There's still some instances where national law might come in because the regulation contains opening clauses, or because the EU is not competent for certain areas. For example, to define a competent authority, to define criminal sanctions or administrative fines. So all this is left to the national to the individual member states, and you will have to look into the European regulation, the national law, and additionally, what you can see here, some guidance documents which have proved extremely important and useful. So guidance on medical devices is issued by the Medical Devices Coordination Group, which is established at EU level, consisting of representatives of all EU member states, and which is chaired by a representative of the EU Commission. Guidance documents are not binding, but they are extremely helpful to get your way through the new provisions, especially in the absence of any case law or decision-making practice so far. In relation to clinical investigation, you can already find 12 guidance documents published by the MDCG, and you see the link on the slide, and which we will distribute then later on. So transitional provisions, I talked about that. For clinical investigations, just having a look at the EU provision, clinical investigations which have already started to be conducted under the old directive. So prior to the application date in May 2021, may continue to be conducted, but the reporting of serious adverse events is already covered by the new regulation as of the 26th of May. And there are also transitional provisions in the German law, which is the Medical Devices Implementation Act, and MPDG. Yeah, I will not go into detail here. You will be able to look at this in the slides. So, another important aspect of the new law is that we have much more differentiated types of clinical investigations. And this is not just for definition purposes or just for fun, but every type of clinical investigation entails different regulatory pathway, be it an application, a full approval, simplified approval, or none of that. Assessment of the ethics committee, is it prescribed by the European law or German law, or is it just an issue of professional law? So all these differences can be found here in these different groups. So to guide you a little bit through, the main difference to make is the purpose of the clinical investigation. So is it an investigation made to gather data for a conformity assessment procedure, or is it an investigation for other purposes? So only if it is for conformity assessment, it will be covered by the MDR or IVDR. If it's not for conformity assessment purposes, just for scientific or other purposes, then it will be covered by national law. So the dark blue ones are the the blue ones are the ones that are regulated by at EU level. The yellow ones are those which are just covered by national law, and the green one is a special one that concerns clinical investigations with products that are, or medical devices that are already CE marked, that are investigated within the intended purpose for which the CE mark has been granted, or the CE certificate has been granted, but is conducted in order to get additional data on, let's say, safety or performance of the device. Then we would call it a post-market clinical follow-up study. And if additionally this study entails additional burdensome and or invasive procedures, then it is covered by EU regulation and entails at least an application procedure. So all these steps need to be gone through and thought through, and ideally documented. So, going on. So because we just talked about it, what do we understand under burdensome and invasive? That's a good example where the MDCG guidance can be very helpful. You can find at least some hints in this document number 6 of 2021. So burdensome would be if it causes pain, discomfort, fear, etc. Invasive if the body is penetrated through its surface, and so on. It's still evolving definitions, and the advice that is given to sponsors is because this is also unclear. So before you decide that it's not burdensome, or there's no additional burden for patients, or it's not invasive, which may lead to the conclusion that no regulatory requirement applies because the device is already CE marked. It's inside the approved purpose. So you decide, I can just perform this trial. I don't have to do anything. Before you do that, it's advised that you document your decision, especially with regard to absence of additional burdensome aspects like additional examinations which might cause pain, etc. So be aware of the decision you make before you say, I don't have to do anything, I don't have to apply for approval, or I don't have to make a notification to the authority. So at a glance, the distinction I just talked about, conformity, relevant, or other clinical investigations. Blue would be covered by EU law. Green is purely national, with some minor exceptions. I won't go into this detail. You find this in Article 82 of the MDR if you're interested in further information. So conformity would mean performance, clinical benefit, safety. So if the data are collected for that purpose, and the German law definition is very strongly focused on whether there is a clinical development plan in place or not. If the data are collected in order to pursue a clinical development plan, then it's a conformity assessment study, which is covered by the MDR. If it's a study purely for scientific or other purposes, then it would be it's not with the aim to demonstrate the conformity of a product with requirements, but then it would be covered mainly by national law. So, to round this up, you can see again a decision tree here, application and approval procedures. So the left column means the conformity assessment procedure. So if it's not an other clinical investigation, is it relevant for the, or does it have a CE marking? No, it does not. It's a classical clinical trial, so you gather the data so in order that the CE marking can be granted. And this also includes cases where you have a CE marking, but you want to gather data for an additional purpose for which is not yet CE marked. So that would also be a classical clinical trial. So these clinical trials, clinical investigations require approval of the competent authority. And there are two different approval procedures. If it's class 1, risk class 1, or 2A without non-invasive device, then it would be a simplified procedure. If it is a higher risk class or invasive, then it's the full approval procedure. Simplified means that after a certain time of notification of the authority, if the authority does not object, you can put the product on the market. The classical authorization, you have to wait until the approval is actually granted. So if we are at the national pathway, then a notification of this other clinical trial must be done to the higher federal authority, and an approval of the ethics committee is also required. An exception, and that's a little bit a parallel to the post-market follow-up under EU law, if the CE marked device is used within the scope of the intended purpose and there are no additional invasive or burdensome procedures, then the notification requirement does not apply, and also the medical law does not require approval by the EC. But beware, so the investigator who's a medicine under the local professional law in Germany still is obliged to consult with the competent ethics committee, ethics committee competent for that investigator. So make sure that in your clinical trial agreement you put this obligation on the investigator, so you're on the safe side as the manufacturer. So then just one example where the delimitation becomes important. We see that often in practice where companies conduct so-called pilot studies, feasibility studies, often not with the final device, but with a prototype. And the question is that already a clinical investigation for conformity purposes, or is that another clinical investigation? Or maybe is it a clinical investigation at all? So very often the answer is, even if a prototype is used, and even if the number of humans is very small, where first trials, feasibility studies are performed, this is very likely to be a clinical investigation. And if this is even at the beginning of a clinical investigation plan, so to gather first data, the first step, this is often already a conformity assessment study. And this is in line with the guidance given by the MDCG in this document. So in case of doubt, make sure it is recommended to apply under the Article 62, so to go for the full application procedure under the MDR, the approval procedure. So now I hand over to my colleague Irina Rebin, who will talk about clinical trials with medicinal products.
Thank you, Manja. The European Union has now another regulation on clinical trials which deals with medicinal products, and which entered into full force on the 31st of January in last year. This new CTR replaces our former legal framework, the Good Clinical Practice Directive from 2001, and the regulation is, through its unrestricted applicability in all member states of the European Union, it leads to a harmonization of the application procedure, authorization, and the supervision of clinical trials in the EU. The CTR provides for a transition period of 3 years for clinical trials, which can be understood as follows. From January 2022 to January 2023, sponsors were allowed to choose if they wish to apply for approval according to the former legal framework under the GCP directive, or according to the new requirements of this new CTR. Now, as of the 31st of January 2023, all applications for new clinical trials in the European Union have to be submitted in accordance with this new CTR requirements. And with regard to clinical trials initiated under the former legal framework, these old but still ongoing clinical trials will have to be transferred to the new CTR procedure as of the 31st of January in 2025. Although this does not necessarily mean that a new authorization procedure of the ongoing clinical trial according to the CTR provisions is required or will be required, all study documents must be entered into the new clinical trial information system. And in July 2023, a few months ago, the EMA has published a very helpful but short questions and answers document as to how transfer an old but ongoing clinical trial into the new CTR procedure. So what are the main changes introduced by the new regulation on clinical trials with medicinal products? The most important novelty is, of course, or definitely, the new approval procedure for clinical trials, which I will discuss with you on the following slide. With regard to this new approval procedure, the European Commission established a new IT system, the Clinical Trials Information System. from now on, as I said, sponsors have to submit their applications for approval of the intended clinical trial through this new CTIS system, which acts as a communication platform between the sponsor and the respective competent authorities of the member states. Please note that the submission of applications through this new CTIS is mandatory for both mononational and multinational clinical trials, which means even if you intend to conduct your clinical trial at only one trial site in one member state, you need to use CTIS and you are no longer allowed to submit your documents directly to the competent authorities of the member states. Another novelty is the CTR contains an extensive catalog of definitions. Luckily, not all of them are new, but the CTR now contributes to a uniform understanding of the terms used in the context of clinical trials with medicinal products. The term clinical trial, for example, is now to be understood under the generic term of a clinical study. Please note that this new CTR is only applicable to clinical trials and thus not applicable to non-interventional clinical studies. So in case you wish to conduct a non-interventional study, for example, an observational study with your medicinal product, make sure to get an overview of national requirements governing the conduct of such non-interventional studies. They are, as I said, not governed by this CTR. In addition, when it comes to new terms, we now have a uniform definition of a low interventional clinical trial, and moreover, sponsors may further choose to conduct so-called cluster randomized clinical trials with less stringent requirements for obtaining informed consent from the trial subjects. But please note that with regard to so-called cluster randomized clinical trials, it is up to the member states to decide if they allow the conduct of such a cluster randomized clinical trial. And in Germany, for example, it is not allowed to conduct such cluster randomized clinical trials. Further, the CTR introduces the possibility of clinical trials to be conducted by several sponsors. So not only one sponsor, but several sponsors. And this is the concept of so-called co-sponsoring or co-sponsorship. And the primary requirement set forth in the CTR is a clear allocation of tasks and division of all sponsors' responsibilities in a written contract, which needs to be mandatorily concluded between all co-sponsors. Moreover, the provisions on the protection of trial subjects are now extensively broadened. On the one hand, we have two very detailed articles in this CTR to the requirements for informed consent, laying down detailed provisions on the content, on the scope, on the execution and obtainment of the informed consent. And on the other hand, this CTR also provides detailed requirements for the inclusion of certain patient groups like minors, adults who are not capable of giving informed consent to patients in emergency situations, and even pregnant and breastfeeding women. And finally, there is an extension of the retention periods of trial documents. The CTR now obliges the investigator and the sponsors to store the contents of their trial master file for at least 25 years after the end of the clinical trial. And this is a novelty that should from now on be specified accordingly in your clinical trial agreements. So now let's move forward to the new approval procedure introduced by the CTR. This new procedure is based on a single submission of application documents through the new clinical trials information system, following a validation and an assessment procedure, and leading to a single decision issued by the member states and transmitted through CTIS to the sponsors. The first advantage of this new approval procedure, before we discuss it a little in more detail, is that the sponsor is not required to submit its application documents to several competent authorities of all member states where the clinical trial shall be conducted. And moreover, the documents to be submitted are now harmonized and listed in Annex 1 to the CTR, so that the sponsor does not need to evaluate on a case-by-case basis which member state requires which specific documents. And the second advantage I wanted to point out is that the sponsor is no longer required to submit the application documents to a competent authority on the one hand, and to the competent ethics committee on the of the respective member state on the other hand. Under the former legal framework of the GCP directive, it was mandatory to obtain 2 approvals from the competent authority and the ethics committee. Now, as you can see on the right side, there will only be 1 decision given to the sponsor through CTIS and issued by the competent authorities of the member states concerned. It is now all up to the member states to make sure that they have procedures in place and to decide to which extent ethics committees will be involved in the approval procedure on a national level. Now, if we take a closer look at this new approval procedure, this new approval procedure consists of a coordinated assessment in order to harmonize the assessment of multinational clinical trials. The coordinated assessment will be led by 1 reporting member state, which I named REMS just to shorten it. It will be led by 1 reporting member state throughout clinical trials whole life cycle. Sponsors may request a specific reporting member state, but if more than 1 member state is willing to take over the responsibility as the reporting or the coordinating member state, the member states will align internally and have to agree who will take over this responsibility. The reporting member state has 6 days from the submission of the application dossier to notify the sponsor if it is that it is the reporting member state for the clinical trial. Moreover, this is also pointed out on the left side of this slide. At the latest, within 10 days following the submission of the application documents, the reporting member state will notify the sponsor that the documents are complete or otherwise request the submission of missing documents, so that the sponsor will then have 10 days to submit whatever is missing. After this first step on the left side, the validation procedure, the member states will then conduct the assessment procedure. They will review the documents submitted, exchange information on the intended clinical trial, and draft an evaluation report. And this assessment procedure will take up to 45 days in a best case scenario if no further alignment with the sponsor is necessary. And as I said, the whole communication with the sponsor and the member states will take place through CTIS. As you can see on the slide in the middle section, the evaluation report consists of 2 different parts. Part 1 of the evaluation report deals with general or technical and scientific aspects of the clinical trial, for example, information on the investigational medicinal products, its labelings, and the import into the European Union. And part 2 of the evaluation reports deals with aspects with more national and ethical aspects, such as the informed consent of the trial subjects. With regard to these 2 parts of the evaluation report, the responsibility of the reporting member state is tremendous. The reporting member state drives the assessment process for those aspects harmonized on this part 1, including moderating discussions with all other member states, preparing the draft assessment report. And if a reporting member state refuses the part 1 application, it is refused for all other member states. And then it does not matter that any other member state concerned comes to the conclusion that all requirements of this Part 1 aspect are met by the sponsor. The decision of the reporting member state is then binding not only for the sponsor, but also with regard to all other member states. So yeah, choose your reporting member state carefully. But on the other side, if the reporting member state comes to the conclusion that Part 1 of the evaluation is perfectly met by the sponsor and another member state concerned does not agree to the assessment of the reporting member state, then there are only limited reasons which are specifically stated in the CTR. I think there are only 3 reasons on which the member state concerned may reject the reporting member state's decision on Part 1 of the evaluation. And finally, 5 days following the publication of the evaluation report, after at least 45 days, as you see in the medal section, 5 days following the publication of this evaluation report through CTIS, each member state will notify the sponsor by way of only one single decision if the clinical trial is approved or not. Well, it took almost 9 years to set up the new clinical trial information system, and the feedback we have received so far shows that there are still some bugs and inconsistencies that everyone has to deal with. However, the EMA and the European Commission always provide updates on the functioning of CTIS in general and on specific bug fixes in particular. And there are also detailed manuals and handbooks on the use of CTIS published on the European Commission's website, which all sponsors should become familiar with. So, another topic that we have discussed more intensively with our clients, especially in the past 2 years, has been the use of medical devices or IVDs in clinical trials with medicinal products. In other words, scenarios in which the medical device or the IVD is not itself used as an investigational device in a clinical trial, but it is only used as an accessory in a clinical trial with the drug, and the drug being the investigational medicinal product. Once the MDR and the IVDR, which Manja introduced to you, became applicable in 2021 and 2022, only IVDs and medical devices that complied with the new requirements of the MDR and the IVDR were allowed to be placed on the union market and used on the union market. However, if, for example, medical devices from the US or any other non-European Union states were imported into the European Union to be used in a clinical trial with a medicinal product, many sponsors were faced with the problem that the IVDs were not IVDR ready, or the medical devices were not yet CE marked or not yet MDE compliant. And with view of the late time, I do not want to discuss the following 3 slides with you in detail with regard to this problem. However, if you are facing a similar project when it comes to the use of medical devices or IVDs in your clinical trials, I want to encourage you to have a close look at a very important guidance document published by the Medical Device Coordination Group, which deals in detail with this question, or the question of which medical devices and IVDs and under which circumstances such devices may be used in clinical trials with medicinal products, and you can find it on this 3rd slide to this topic. So, yeah, our last topic for today is clinical trial agreements, aspects to consider in negotiations. First of all, we know from most of our clients that they have their own CTA templates at hand. When it comes to clinical trials to be conducted in the European Union, please note that there might be CTA templates published by competent authorities in the respective member states or competent ethics committees, which use is mandatory, and that the case might be, depending on the respective member state, that only minor changes are allowed to such officially published CTA templates. So another, however, small characteristic is the question of who, in addition to the sponsor, should become a contracting party to a CTA, to a clinical trial agreement, the institution or the investigator, or even both. The regulations we have introduced to you, the CTR, the MDR, and the IVDR, themselves do not specify anything in this regard. However, it should be noted that, for example, local laws in some member states in the European Union require that the principal investigator also enters into a CTA as a contracting party. And this is required, for example, under Polish law. In Germany, on the other hand, most trial sites refuse that their employed principal investigator also becomes a contracting party to the CTA, so that in Germany there are usually two-sided CTAs to be concluded between a sponsor and a trial site. So, in addition to the requirements for clinical trials, in the three regulations, CTR, MDR, and IVDR, there is another European regulation, surprise, surprise, that has an impact on the conduct of clinical trials, namely the European General Data Protection Regulation from 2016. The GDPR now unifies standards in the European Union with regard to the processing of personal data, especially sensitive categories of data such as health data, so that the provisions of the GDPR must be observed when conduct clinical trials in the European Union. The CTR, MDR, and IVDR do not themselves contain any requirements for the protection of personal data of trial subjects. And a general requirement that is of importance to us for today is that under the GDPR, a legal basis is always required to process personal data. Such a legal basis is, for example, a specific law or a legal provision in a regulation. However, a legal basis for processing personal data can also be the informed consent of the person concerned, which is pretty known to us, all of us. The GDPR leaves it up to the member states to determine such an appropriate legal basis. And with regard to personal data of subjects in clinical trials, the German legislature, for example, has decided that the subject's data may be processed by the institution, the sponsor, or competent authorities if the subject has been extensively informed about this data processing and has given its consent to this processing. To this end, two provisions have been including in German law that place very detailed requirements on consent from a data protection perspective. We have listed these two provisions for clinical trials with drugs on the one hand and with medical devices and IVDs on the other hand on the following two slides, and translated the legal text into English for you. So don't worry, we won't read it together now, but I just wanted to give you an impression how extensive these new provisions are. So what impact do these requirements of the GDPR as implemented in national law have on your CTA negotiations? For us, it is not uncommon to discuss with our clients which party should draft and provide the ICF template. Some sponsors do not have their own ICF templates at hand and therefore want the trial sites to draft the ICF template. And there is no objection to this in principle. However, please note that it is also the regulatory responsibility of the sponsor himself to ensure ensure that consent is given by the trial subjects, in particular consent to the processing of personal data and his health data. Therefore, take the time to check for yourself whether the ICF templates provided by the trial sites meet the current requirements in order to minimize or at best exclude the risk that the data have been unlawfully collected or shared with you as the sponsor or the clinical research organizations, for example, because the subjects were not effectively informed about the data processing. So on the slide, this new section 40b in the German AMG governing the conduct of clinical trials in Germany sets out, as you can see, very detailed requirements. And this passage only deals with the informed consent from a privacy law perspective. And on the following slide, you can find the respective provisions applicable to clinical investigations with medical devices and IVDs in Germany. So take your time after this webinar to check if your ICF template meets these current requirements, and make sure that you are aware of any other deviating provisions in other local laws of other member states.
So back to clinical trial agreements and typical issues. I promise that I will not spend more than 2 minutes on this topic, but I would like to mention this topic because it's relevant in almost all the CTAs that we get for review. So you might know that under German law, the Employee Inventions Act is mandatory, and it is not allowed to include buyout clauses in the agreements. So providing for the transfer of all IP that is generated under any agreement, including clinical trial agreements, to the sponsor. So any inventions made by employees of the clinic that you're working with, subject to the Employee Inventions Act, and normally the employee is obliged to notify a invention made within his or her profession, and then the sponsor has got the clinic has got, the employer has got the possibility to claim this invention. So it is important to cover this process of notification, a claim appropriately into the clinical trial agreement. And there's one other specific resulting from the Employee Inventions Act, and that's the mandatory claim of the employee for remuneration. And because this is the case, also the clinics are very keen on getting an extra remuneration for the transfer of employee inventions and maybe also other IP to the sponsor. So this is often a very, very difficult discussion, and we recommend there are several solutions. So the best solution would be of course, to say that the remuneration is included, the remuneration for the clinic is included in the payment made to the clinic by the sponsor, and then the clinic should take a part of this money and give it to its employees. But this almost never works. So the alternative is either the clinic accepts a lump sum that is already agreed in the CTA itself, which is the safest solution for the sponsor, because you can calculate with amounts and you're sure that you get the employee invention transferred to you. Or in the worst case, you have to agree on a sort of clause that is very open, just saying that the transfer will be granted against standard market remuneration, which creates some uncertainty in the agreement. So, and because this is maybe still too easy, there are things that complicate this issue, and this is that most of the university clinics are public bodies, and are subject to special rules for academic employees, which you find in Article Section 42 of the Employee Invention Act, which grants a positive and a negative right of publication. All this stems from the constitutional right of academics, the academic freedom, the freedom of research, freedom of teaching, which includes a right not to notify an employee invention made by an academic employed by a university clinic. So in order to circumvent this problem, so that the sponsor still can get this agreement, it is necessary to conclude a separate agreement between the sponsor as a private company and the individual, so the individual academic employee, in order to make sure that the employee obliges or undertakes to notify employee inventions to its employers, so those can be claimed and transferred to the sponsor. So what we normally do is to attach a template to the CTA, which provides for this separate agreement between the sponsor and the individual academic. And in the CTA, we would include a clause that obliges the institution to only involve those employees in clinical trials who have previously signed this waiver of this negative right of publication, so the obligation to notify inventions to the academic employer. Just as at a glance, there are also other aspects to consider with these academic employees, but this is probably the most important one. And as I said, it is relevant for almost all our clients in the context of clinical trial agreements. So now we've reached the end of the presentations. Thank you very much for your attention and patience. And I think we have still some time to go for questions. Alan.
Yeah, no, thank you, Manja, and thank you, Irina. Great questions, great analysis. A couple of questions I think that y'all can probably knock out quickly. There was a question, I think y'all had a decision tree earlier, Manja. The question was, is that same decision tree applicable to medicinal products?
I think I can already say no. This is a specific. These are specific provisions for medical devices. So the procedure for medicinal products would be the procedure that Irina has just presented. So that's not comparable.
Okay. And then I think, Irina, you may have mentioned something about retaining records for 25 years. The comment was that seems like a long retention period. So do you want to comment about that? I think you probably see the question. I don't know if you'll comment on that.
Yes, sure. This is I know, a pretty broad retention period. 25 years is a long time. The 25 years retention period refers to the trial master file. And as you may know, the sponsor and the institution are both responsible for their parts of the trial master file. And the question that came up was, that is a long retention period. Can we agree in a CTA that at the end of the trial, if we are just aside, that we will return to the sponsor the documents and they can retain them? I would say no, because this is a regulatory obligation and the CTR addressed to both parties, the sponsor on the one side and the institution on the other side. And the trial master file contains different documents that may not be accessible from a legal perspective by the sponsor. So it's up to the institution and the investigator to make sure that they retain these documents for at least 25 years, or maybe delegated to a service provider if they are not able to do so on their own. But the overall regulatory responsibility stays with the institution and the investigator.
Okay, thanks. Question about experience with FDA inspections and FDA guidance. Can FDA issue a warning letter for not complying with guidance versus regulation? The short answer is no. Guidance is guidance. In fact, FDA will always say, it's kind of boilerplate if you've been in the industry for a while, this is not legally binding on us or you, basically, except they will always say it's current thinking. The current thinking sometimes can go back to 1970s, but it's still the current thinking. In this case, guidance is just that. It's guidance. It's kind of what FDA expects, its expectations, its recommendations, but they can't cite you for providing a guidance. What they'll cite you for is a regulation. Now, is it possible that they can say, you didn't follow the regulation, and while they won't say it in print, had you followed the guidance, you would have been pretty good, but they're not going to cite you for violating a guidance. And by the way, for those who may be newer to industry, FDA can issue draft guidance and final guidance. Neither one of those is still legally binding. Draft guidance is really kind of, here's what we're thinking right now. And then final guidance is, we've gotten your comments and we've decided to finalize what we're thinking, but it's still not legally binding. So that's the way to think about that. And let me see if we have any other questions. Is an radiative treatment considered as an invasive treatment? That's probably a question for one of y'all, unless that's a question for FDA.
Maybe not invasive, but I would say it puts an additional burden on the patient, because usually irradiation has some side effects or negative effects on the patient. So X-ray or other procedures which are not needed for the normal treatment, but which are made in order to gather data. So additional treatments like that, or additional diagnostics like that, yes, would be considered an additional burden and would trigger then the regulatory requirements like notifications to the authority.
All right. In the interest of time, and we've gone over, and I'm supposed to be at a partnership meeting, I've enjoyed it. I do want to thank Manja and Rebin for co-hosting with me. We hope you found today's webinar useful and informative. If you have a question that you didn't ask, or we didn't answer a question, feel free to reach out to us respectively. I think I can speak for Manja that we would prefer not hypothetically speaking we've got a specific product, because that'd be legal advice. But you know how to reach us if you couldn't understand something about the slide or generally. I think our contact information are in the handouts. And please remember to complete the survey, to leave your feedback, and obtain CLE credit if that's applicable here. Manja and Irina, thank you so much. Let me also thank the marketing group of Taylor Wessing and AGG as well, because they made all of this look good. We just spoke. So again, thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks to the AGG team. And yeah, have a nice day, have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.